How damaging are the email leaks from the UAE's ambassador to the US? al-Otaiba questions Donald Trump's ability to be president. What are the ramifications of that? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. In Doha, I'm Adrian Finighan. The Arabian Peninsula is a confusing place right now. Qatar's neighbours have cut long-standing alliances overnight. But another historically strong alliance between the UAE and the US is being strained by emails which have been leaked. In the third disclosure within a week, emails from the inbox of the UAE's ambassador to the US show direct criticism of President Donald Trump. Previous leaks attacked Kuwait, Qatar and Iran. From Washington, Shihab Ratanzi reports.
As the Donald Trump presidency loomed ever closer on election night last year, the UAE ambassador to Washington wrote an email to a senior Middle East advisor to President Obama. The advisor had jokingly suggested he might want to emigrate to the United Arab Emirates. Yusuf al-Otaiba replied, "This isn't funny. How? Why is this happening? On what planet can Trump be a president?" Earlier in the evening, the ambassador asked the same Obama advisor, Robert Malley, about the election results. "Do you guys receive advanced info from the polls?" asked Otaiba. "Wouldn't you like to know?" responded Malley. Otaiba used Trump as a figurative device when responding to an email from the right-wing US commentator Judith Miller. "The 7 minutes I spent reading this was the equivalent of watching 7 minutes of Donald Trump. A waste of my time," he wrote. The emails reveal the ambassador was close to Susan Rice, President Obama's national security advisor. In one, she criticizes Joe Biden after the ambassador notifies her of one of the vice president's speeches on the connection between the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and violent extremism.
Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria.
Whoever leaked these emails says the intent is to expose the, quote, two-faced, end quote, nature of Emirati foreign policy and denies any link with Qatar, currently the object of sanctions by the UAE, Saudi Arabia and other nations. Over the weekend, other leaked emails showed the ambassador cooperating closely with pro-Israel think tanks in attempting to discredit Qatar.
It certainly shows a high level of UAE skepticism over Qatar, and it shows where in public UAE officials will say their prime focus is Iran or the Muslim Brotherhood, etc. It seems their prime focus in these messages has been about their neighboring state, Qatar. So it shows a lot about their influence, their access, and the kind of agenda they're pushing.
Now the focus will be on whether this latest dump of emails affects the UAE's relationship with President Trump, who's not a man who's taken criticism lightly in the past. Shihab Ratanzi, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Well, let's bring in our guests for today's discussion. Joining me here in Doha is Sultan Barakat, who's Director of the Centre for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. From Washington, D.C., we're joined by Richard Weitz, Director of the Centre for Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute, and also in Doha. Joining us, Luciano Zaccara, who's Assistant Professor of Gulf Politics at the Gulf Studies Centre at Qatar University. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Sultan, if we can start with you, what do you make of this latest leak in this tranche of emails that have been released that show that the UAE's ambassador to the US denigrating Donald Trump and others in communications with Obama administration officials?
Well, to be honest, the denigration part of it is not what concerns me, because I think at that time, not only him, but a lot of diplomats and many of us around the world could not genuinely believe that Obama can ever make it to become a president.
Donald Trump could be
Donald Trump could ever make it to a president. So I think in that sense, that part of the exchange may be brushed aside, and I suspect that Trump and his administration will try and do that, given the success of his visit to the Middle East a couple of weeks ago.
We'll come to the rest of your concerns then about it in just a moment. But first, Richard Weitz, if I can bring you in, do you agree with what you've just heard there? Will President Trump, who's known to hold a grudge, see the remarks in the email as a slight? Is it going to affect the UAE's relations with the Trump administration?
I concur fully with your guess. I think that what if the email leaks are accurate, what the ambassador was saying was what I think we were all hearing for months during the election campaign here in Washington, not only among the diplomatic community, but certainly many of the foreign embassies were concerned. They didn't quite know what his positions would be. Trump made statements that seemed to challenge many conventional U.S. policies, support for NATO, opposition to nonproliferation, opposition to multilateral free trade agreements. And so there are a lot of embassies were concerned. But of course, since his election, there's been a mainstreaming of his policy, and as your guest mentioned, that included what was seen, at least in the White House, as a successful visit to the Middle East. In terms of the personal relations with President Trump, it is possible that if he were ever to be in a situation to meet the ambassador, would feel uncomfortable. But I think that anyone else, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, any of the possible people who will be involved in the current dispute with Qatar, I think that this would not have any impact on how they're going to approach the issue.
Okay, Luciano, let's bring you in. Do you concur then that this is a little overblown? It is embarrassing, though, isn't it, for the UAE and their mission there in Washington?
Yeah, it is embarrassing, of course, but I agree with my other two colleagues that this is not enough to create a diplomatic rift between the United States and United Arab Emirates. I think a lot of head of states, a lot of diplomats expressed their concerns about Trump being president, and now all of them, they have to deal with Trump. So nothing will change in that sense. And moreover, we heard a lot of things said by Trump himself about a lot of head of states and a lot of countries around the world. And however, Trump is dealing with all those countries, mainly Muslim countries, and he was very aggressive at the beginning of the campaign. So I don't think this specific issue of the emails will affect significantly the relations between Emirates and the United States right now.
Okay, so that's that issue dealt with. Let's take a look, though, at some of the other issues raised as a result of the UAE leaked emails. The first batch revealed how the UAE actively lobbied to ruin the reputations of Kuwait and Qatar. The leak also revealed that the UAE recently worked with pro-Israeli think tanks against Iran, and emails from 4 years ago show the UAE ambassador encouraging the US to support the Egyptian military coup, which overthrew President Mohammed Morsi. Sultan, you said you were more concerned about the wider issues behind this email. What are those issues?
I mean, what concerns analysts is the fact that this has been going on for some years to start with. And we can really trace it all the way to the Gaza war and the alliance between the United Arab Emirates and Israel on two issues. One was the Gaza and its impact, and then their common perceived threat in terms of Iran. Those two issues, I think, have driven a lot of the politics behind the UAE wanting to marginalize and push aside Qatar. The other is simple rivalry between two relatively similar in terms of power within Washington, D.C., influence within Washington, D.C., but United Arab Emirates wanted to have the upper hand. And by nature, I think the United Arab Emirates have been calling for much greater interventionist policies from the U.S. in the Middle East ever since 2014. And they probably see Qatar being much more shaded in terms of its politics. It's not very clear. They don't take a straight position on a number of issues, and in particular the Muslim Brotherhood issue, which for the Emiratis, they see it as a red line. For them, it's a real threat. It's a threat that they have experienced in the past. They have their own Muslim Brotherhood movement that they worry about. And for the Qataris, they don't share that threat at all. They have a very solid internal front, very well united, which showed itself in the last couple of days under this crisis, which allows them the space and time and the ability to really push different agendas in terms of foreign policy without being concerned about their own stability and their own existence.
Richard Weitz, what did you make of what you heard there, particularly about the interventionist policies pushed by the UAE, encouraging the US, for instance, to support Egypt's military to oust former President Morsi?
Yes, there is clearly several factors at work, as our previous guest said. There's some probably personal rivalries. There's also regional rivalry. There is differences over policy. You mentioned Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood. Here in the U.S., you could also say Iran. But just more fundamentally, it's that we've seen for the past several decades as Qatar has adopted a somewhat autonomous policy from the other GCC states, or at least several of them, such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and that is led to some differences. I mean, Qatar wants to have more autonomy. That's understandable. The Saudis and the UAE think it's better if all the Gulf states have a unified front in these issues to increase their leverage. And so all these factors are at work with respect to the specific issue of the Egyptian coup. That was a hotly debated issue in Washington and among foreign governments. People were arguing either way whether this was actually a favorable development or not. And the Obama administration took one position, the Trump position has apparently switched.
Luciano, what do you make of what you've heard so far? What's your view on the lobbying by the UAE against fellow GCC countries, Qatar and also Kuwait?
Well, it's clear that apart from Saudi Arabia, which is the biggest and most powerful country in the GCC, and there are other states, mainly Qatar and Emirates, that they are fighting for this second level or second tier group of states within the GCC. And of course, there is a competition between both countries. And supposedly Qatar was winning, at least in the last 20 years. I mean, the World Cup, the way in which Qatar was able to use Al Jazeera as a foreign policy tool along these last 20 years, the success that Qatar obtained after the Arab Spring in some scenarios, in regional scenarios, the least portraying a more active foreign policy. So there was a regional competition between the two countries. And this way, by allying Emirates with Saudi Arabia, they find a way to tackle this influence that Qatar was having along the Arab world. And I think this is something that is not new. I mean, what Al Jazeera has been doing since the beginning of the creation of the network upset a lot of countries and a lot of governments around the region. And this is a way to claim, okay, this is enough. We are asking Qatar to cut this from the root. And if you read most of the newspapers in Emirates or Saudi, they are expressing mainly that Qatar needs to stop spreading this kind of news, fake news, or interviews or whatever that are affecting the other countries. So I think they are trying to use this excuse to cut something that they wanted from the very beginning, which is stop Al Jazeera from affecting other countries.
All right, I don't want to stray too far away in this program from the discussion around the emails for the moment, but just, Sultan, explain for us why other countries might be threatened, other countries in the region might be threatened by an organisation like Al Jazeera, a news-based organisation. It's not like it sets out to tell untruths.
Well, I mean, you have to take it back into history. When Al Jazeera came live, it was a shock. It was a shock to the system. It was a shock to the media in the Arab world. The Arab world was not used to the way the Al Jazeera walked in and offered opinions and opposite opinions, open discussion. The fact that it reached out to Israelis to interview, to people that they perceived as enemies for years, all of this was new. Then came the Iraq war and the graphic illustration of the war. And in those days, in fact, they were an irritant to the United States. And the United States many times complained about the detailed coverage of Al Jazeera, not only in Iraq, but also in Afghanistan. And Al Jazeera managed to stick to its own line. Now, I think the editorial line, particularly on Al Jazeera Arabic, and I'm not saying this because I'm on Al Jazeera English, probably lost its direction a little bit during the Arab Spring. Yeah. It has become pretty much one-sided. They perceive this, that they're taking the side of the people on the streets.
Absolutely, the voice of the voiceless.
And the voice of the voiceless. But from other perspective, they didn't really keep in mind that there are a lot of other voices there did not agree with those who went onto the streets.
Right.
So it was seen as biased, and this is going with the population.
And this is what's annoying Saudi Arabia and the UAE?
What's annoying Saudi Arabia is this, but then also what developed afterwards, because those people in the streets elected the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and Al Jazeera will continue to support those who were elected by the people who happen to be the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, if from a Saudi and Emirati perspective, as we described earlier, the Emirati feel genuine vulnerability towards this issue. The Saudi are probably less worried about the Muslim Brotherhood as such, but they have their own concerns, which Al Jazeera have not left alone. Yeah. The way the change in the arrangement of the monarchy after the death of King Abdullah, King Sultan coming in, appointing his brother, his son-in-law, his nephew as his deputy, and then for the first time creating a deputy position that was unheard of. Yeah. All of this was put him in a very vulnerable position. Right. And that, of course, meant that he needed to shore up his legitimacy, and the only way to do this was to go even closer to al-Sheikh and the Wahhabi movement in Saudi. Now, with that comes an anti-Muslim Brotherhood sentiment, right. And this is where the two really met. Okay. And they continue to perceive Al Jazeera and Qatar as the party that supports the Muslim Brotherhood.
Okay, as I said, I don't want to go too far away from these emails. Richard Weitz, if we can come back to you. Whoever leaked the UAE ambassador's emails told the Huffington Post that they wanted to show the two-faced nature of the UAE's foreign policy. Is that what they show?
Well, they show the reported emails of one person. What we don't know is, what he was saying to the Trump people. And I would have to say that this kind of stance, trying, if you're a foreign diplomat, to reach out to all political factions, which sometimes requires you to say bad things about a competing faction, is probably not uncommon at the tactical level. In terms of the overall foreign policy, though, of the UAE and Qatar and so on, these countries are generally very supportive of U.S. initiatives in the region. And I think that weighs more heavily than what their particular representatives are going to say in private emails. I think the people here in Washington are looking at the foreign policies of these governments towards Iran, terrorism, and so on. And as was discussed earlier, some people have expressed some concern about some Qatari positions. But overall, at least on the Obama administration, which is where the leaked emails come from, they were working very closely on many regional initiatives.
All right. The UAE has been accused of buying influence abroad in the past. The Washington-based Sunlight Foundation says in 2013 the UAE spent more than any other country in the world lobbying the US Congress. $14 million was paid then. 2 years ago, the UAE was accused of trying to buy influence in Tunisia by paying secular parties running against the conservative Ennahda party. Also in 2015, the UN Special Envoy to Libya, Bernardino Leon, was forced to resign when it was disclosed that he'd accepted a job with the UAE government while he was mediating the civil war in Libya. The UAE supports one of the warring sides in that conflict. Luciano, the Huffington Post told us that while the prime focus of UAE officials in public is Iran or the Muslim Brotherhood, the prime focus of these leaked emails has been about neighbouring Qatar. It says they show the UAE's influence, their access, the kind of agenda that they're pushing. What do you make of that?
Well, all the countries in the region have their own agenda, their own interests. Some interests are public, some interests are hidden. And of course, as you say, the main enemy in the region is Iran. But of course, there is a competition, an internal competition within the GCC. Emirates in this leaked emails, what is showing that, of course, there is some concern about other states in the region and how to push for lobbying in Washington and in other scenarios in order to benefit themselves. I think this is nothing to be surprised about. I assume that if we read the emails of the private emails of all the diplomats around the region, we will find similar statements. The problem is how careful are the diplomats to send emails without expressing personal concerns that are against or are opposed to the official perception or official position they have in public summits or in conferences.
Sultan, what did you make of what you heard there? Also, I wanted to ask you what you make of the timing of the release of these emails, coming as they did after President Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia. Then we have the hacking of the Qatar news agency and the release of these emails.
I think the timing has probably got to do with some entities feeling this is the time to make deals. I mean, there's been movement in the Middle East that hasn't happened for the last 8 years in terms of American interest in the region. And everybody started to think maybe we will get our side of the deal. And one thing that really concerns me, I think, is when we talk about the double-faced diplomacy and politics, is that United Arab Emirates continuously talk about Iran as its arch enemy. They occupy islands from them. They've been at odds for a long time. But in fact, the trade between the two continues, and it has averaged over the last 5 years to about $15 billion and jumped to more than $40 billion since the sanctions were lifted on Iran. And none of the measures that were taken against Qatar in the last couple of days were ever tested or implemented against the arch enemy by anybody. So you have this situation where you're trying to convince your brother to stand by you to fight your enemy, and your brother does not see you really cutting your relationship or doing anything serious about this. But they get punished much more if they say we want to have an independent voice here. And I think that is worrying, because we do need Qatar or countries like Qatar to maintain independent voice, because you could see from the way the various crises erupting in the region, we don't really have a clear vision of where we're heading as a region. And if we all suddenly march behind the drumming to go to war with Iran, we'll probably end up in a war with Iran.
And Richard, one final thought from you. How much more proactive should the US be in resolving this crisis that's erupted in the region diplomatically?
Yeah, I think that looking at the perspective, the possible U.S. role in all this, I think I'm hoping that the U.S. military, General Mattis in particular, and now Secretary of Defense Mattis, takes a role. I think that he's worked with these countries. I think he's comfortable with the different perspectives of the Qataris and the UAE on some of the issues we discussed, Iran and others. And I think that the U.S. military has some good contacts it could use to perhaps resolve the crisis before, as I think, as our previous guest said, it becomes very destructive to regional commerce, regional alignments. It's still early on. It's still not clear what we're going to need to do to solve the crisis. But I think that the U.S., through its military, could offer one means of helping to resolve that.
And there, gentlemen, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it for today. We're out of time. Many thanks indeed for being with us, Sultan Barakat, Richard Weitz and Luciano Zaccara. And as always, thank you for watching. Don't forget you can see the programme at any time by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, join us on our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also tweet us. Our handle, AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian, Finighan, and the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Bye for now.